would have access to the A through G required courses. That's more than a century after Plessy. I'm going to quickly lead us to what took place last Friday, and then I'm going to comment on the substance of this case and compel us to understand that, in my view, why it's not only important, but essential. In 1946, we had Mendez. Equal protection meant equal access to school regardless of race. 1971, Serrano versus Priest. John Serrano was the parent of one of several LA Unified students. Vegara is not new. Ivy Baker Priest was the state treasurer at the time. The funding of public schools was unequal and violated the equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment, and embedded in the state constitution of this state. Stemming from the court case in 1968, the Superior Court of Los Angeles found that California's method of funding public schools, because of district-to-district disparities, failed to meet the requirements of the 14th Amendment and that violated the Constitution of California. District-to-district inequities resulted in disparities and a lesser educational opportunity depending on where you lived. And in the 3 subsequent decisions it has taken to enact Serrano, Serrano 2, Prop 13, and compliance, they have all sought to implement the original Serrano case. And of course we still struggle today. The Butt case. A school district could not shorten its school year by 6 weeks because it was having money problems. Students have the right to the same amount of time in school. So far that we've established that there's equal protection of the law for fiscal support, that's not disproportional, and for time, that is not disproportional. 2004, Williams. Unequal investment is required to provide equal opportunity. 2010, Reed, here in Los Angeles. The Reed case was a state decision to reduce funding that resulted in the violation of the 14th Amendment and the Constitution. When we went through the series of unprecedented budget cuts, districts around the state were required to lay teachers off in accordance with the statutes at the time. I was in that trial and I was on the stand for 3 days. The result of that last in, first out, or sometimes called the life out statute, was aggravated and activated by the fiscal situation. There were gross disparities to youth and to some classes of youth. There were a number of schools who had the majority of their faculty as very young in their career, or their lowest seniority number. Examples were Markham, Gompers, Lathy, and there were others. When the layoffs came in that year, those faculty saw 40, 50, and 70% of their entire staff laid off because of their seniority, while other faculties across LAUSD had few and some had none of their faculty laid off. It is further the note that these schools had the student body of the most impacted youth. They all lived in circumstances of poverty and peril. Nearly all struggled to speak English with proficiency as their first language. And almost the entirety of the student body was black or brown. At the end of that ruling, the judge here in Los Angeles found that students had a constitutional right to stability, that it was fundamentally a violation to remove that large number of faculty. Second, that you can't collectively bargain away students' rights. And thirdly, that certain schools are disproportionately affected by LIFO. Thus, declaratory relief included the skipping of the most impacted schools by this statute. We chose to take his ruling and enact it. And in those schools, which are called Reed schools, when the next year of rifts came, they were skipped over, and that those rifts went further out into the system. That case has continued to be appealed and has been remanded by UTLA. Now we've established that youth have an equal protection under the law for stability and continuity of the teachers that they need and deserve. That is not disproportionate. Then the recent court case of Doe versus Deasy compelled the district to adhere to the Stull Act as it was modified in General Assembly. We had for years been implementing a teacher evaluation system that was not compliant with the Stull Act. And as a result of that, the judge ordered that we were not in compliance, and we sought a negotiated agreement. That negotiated agreement was enacted and is being challenged in the PERB venue. So now comes Vegara. We've argued and fought and have established that California children have an equal opportunity to access education without regard to race or nationality, have an equal opportunity to the same level of funding without regard to their residence, have an equal opportunity to be supported in the materials and facilities they need to learn, have an equal opportunity to the same amount of time to attend school without regard to the fiscal conditions of their city or their school district, have an equal opportunity to the same stability of faculty without regard to the seniority of the staff of the school they happen to attend, and have an equal opportunity to be assured that the evaluation process used for the quality and development of the teachers will be followed as intended in the law. Should they not have the same equal opportunity to the quality of instruction without regard to any law that may otherwise compromise that? The Constitution of this state, among other things, guarantees that education is, quote, essential to the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people, and further states that any person may not be denied equal protection under the law. Our 14th Amendment to the Constitution is embedded in our own state constitution. The Supreme Court of California has long history in recognizing that equal opportunity to access quality education is every child's fundamental constitutional right. So in May of 2010, 9 California public school children, several from Los Angeles, filed a lawsuit now known as Vegara versus California. The suit seeks to strike down a set of statutes that they believe keep schools and districts from preventing a student's right to equal protection under the law. In short, these statutes, as they stand and are operationalized, do not prevent grossly ineffective teachers from being in front of youth, but disproportionately so in front of youth who live in circumstances of poverty, who are black, who are Latino, and do not speak English proficiently as their first language. In short, they seek to strike down, as currently written and enacted, the following statutes. The Permanent Employment Statute, or commonly called the Tenure Law. In California, this grants tenure after 2 years of successful service in the state of California. In order to make that law and follow the compliance, a principal and a teacher would have to have gone through evaluation, and the principal would have to have decided to either award or not award tenure in about 14 months. Because you have to have your first year, and then you have to make the deadlines of the second year to provide due and appropriate notice, provide that decision to the Board of Education, have the Board of Education act on that decision, and then notify the employee before March of the second year. The entire program that we use to support teachers, VITSA, doesn't conclude by the time a person has already decided whether they have or do not have tenure. The very supports to help you become a great teacher are not completed by the time an award decision has to be given in tenure. The second is the dismissal statute. This is a very different statute. This governs how teachers are fired. In short, there is a very lengthy, very detailed, somewhat convoluted to understand process by which a teacher is fired in the state of California. The reasons for firing are serious. Sometimes they're grave. Sometimes they take into account gross misconduct, violations of laws, inability to teach. And in California, school boards hire teachers, but they don't fire teachers. They accept a recommendation, and then the process moves to an outside entity headed by a law judge and a panel of 3 teachers, who then hears a case and then makes a decision and either upholds it or remands it. And then there's a series of 11 steps towards appeal you can do after that. It sometimes takes years to terminate a teacher, sometimes decades to terminate a teacher. It was argued in the case that teachers in the most egregious behavior, there must be a quicker way to exit them from the system. And the last of the statutes is the last in, first out, or LIFO statute, which governs which teachers are to be dismissed when fiscal circumstances require a reduction in force. And the way that this works is that we use seniority as the basis. Skipping is permitted if you own a license or a credential that is deemed important, but it still must be in order of seniority. So therefore, the youngest teachers in terms of service to the district go first, on up. I personally agree that the challenge statutes harm certain groups of youth, and I have believed that for many years. I agree that there is a better and more responsible way to deal with the underlying circumstances for which these statutes are required. I agree that egregious and irreparable harm comes to youth, some youth, and not all youth, when the statutes are applied equally across a system. In other words, I believe that the equal treatment of youth in unequal circumstances is injustice. I also believe that teachers should and must have tenure, and all of the protections that come with tenure, and that are afforded to a teacher when this incredibly important decision is made. I don't believe that I or anybody else could possibly make such a judgment in 14 months. I think it's a disservice to the honor of the profession. I don't think it should be forever, but I do believe that the ability of time to have even remediated and provided the support should at least be completed before you make a decision that a district in California will provide that teacher employment for life. I also believe that it should be easier to fire teachers who commit egregious harm and criminal acts to children, and who, after significant investment in their development and improvement, can't demonstrate that they can meet the standards that a district has established for competence. And I believe that when forced to by fiscal circumstances beyond our control, we have to reduce the number of teachers. I believe that we honor the profession by considering factors other than the date that they are hired as a basis for having to make this gut-wrenching decision. That the simple credential and licensure status isn't a proxy for competence. It's a precursor for growing competent in the profession. So when I was deposed in the case, and when I was summoned and stood in the stand for 3 days, I testified as such, and to the harm that the current statutes cause, and my devastation in seeing that when I follow these laws, I see that they violate the rights of some of our youth. I don't believe that striking them down and eliminating them is what this is about. It's about, is there a path to where the youth have a set of rights that the adults can have? I am convinced that the rights of adults can and must coincide in the same strength as the constitutional rights of youth in our school. I do believe that all means all. I think all youth and adults in public schools are created free and equal. I believe that all youth and adults in public schools possess the same inherent rights. And I believe that the legitimate government of this state has to be based on the consent of the governed and must exist to secure those rights for both students and adults. This is how I think about that in education. Students' rights are a very precious and fragile thing. And if you have something precious and fragile, you usually keep it in a safe place. You have an item that's so precious to you, you keep it in a box. And so if you think of youth rights in a box, and there aren't 4 sides to the box, they're going to leak away. And for me, those 4 sides are the work of regulation, what school boards, policies they enact, the work of legislation, what laws a state puts together, the work of negotiations, how we work in this case with our 11 labor unions so that adults are honored and so are students, and in cases, litigation. So when all else fails, we pray for redress in the very system that was founded some 200 years ago. It's not popular sometimes to have the beliefs, and it's certainly not popular sometimes to have to watch a 10, 12, 14, or 16-year-old take a stand and say things for which there is a huge debate over. But I'm very struck by the fact that this district has built 6 of the most astonishing schools on a piece of property not far from here that once stood as the Ambassador Hotel. And I need not go through the entire history of the hotel, but we certainly know that that is the place where RFK accepted the speech of winning the California primary to go on as he was running for President of the United States, and of course was struck down at that hotel. but I'm more taken by his comments in 1966. He was in South Africa at the time. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against an injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million centers of energy and daring, they build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of opposition and resistance. We have not struck down the wall of educational apartheid in this country. You can take one day in a car and go to Hesby Oaks Elementary School, and the same day go to Coliseum Elementary School. And they are but one very small example of very unequal circumstances for the same sets of students. Students and the data in LA, they're not faceless. There's 600,000, and when I do preschool and adult ed, it's 906,000. All of our students come to school expecting to be great. Now the majority, more than 85%, live in circumstances of poverty and peril. The majority do not speak English as their first language yet. The majority are by no means white and privileged. Most struggle to have health care. We think 30 to 40% in their homes are currently not documented. And every single one of them wants to graduate college workforce ready, and they want to be you. They want a roof over their head. They want to participate in this thing called the democratic dream of this country. And we brook nothing that will stand in their way. It does make people uncomfortable at times. I understand that. But to be uncomfortable, you'd have to meet the students who live in cars behind Huntington Park High School, because that is their home. To have to understand what it is to be uncomfortable, you have to meet students where 14 people live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pacoima, because the rest of the families have lost their homes, and still will be the first to graduate from high school. If we want to understand uncomfortable, you could have been with me 2 weeks ago, when we did a routine dental screening. 3rd graders. You know, the dentist comes in, checks your teeth. 3,000 students on that day, 126 had abscesses so bad they required immediate medical attention. How does one learn to read when you need an abscess that requires immediate medical attention? And no one would have known if we hadn't done the routine dental screening. Now that is discomfort. I meet students who have just become moms, who are expecting. And a year ago sat with a group of students, and not one had seen an OBGYN to the day they had their child. In the United States of America today, those things make me uncomfortable. Now there's been critics, some loud, some shrill, some thoughtful, some silent. I'm going to speak about the themes of those critics and then close and how I think about this case. Some say this has been an attack on teachers' rights. I would say quite the opposite. This has been an attempt to talk about the rights of students, not the rights of teachers. And in no case has someone advocated those rights be diminished whatsoever. Some say that the issue on tenure is to strike it down. It should be very, very clear. There's never been part of the testimony I gave, or was deposed under, or believed in. What we've said about this issue of tenure is that it should take into account a reasonable period of time to make such an awesomely important decision. And that solely choosing just 14 months to make the decision of a lifetime is not actually honoring the rights of teachers who get better over time. And we need to give them the time to show that they can do that. There was a great deal of criticism about the last in, first out. You know, it works just fine. It is an objective criteria. The fact that you can't argue the objectivity of the date of hire. Why not use height? It's extremely objective. It is visible to everybody. Everyone understands it. I would argue that no one would do that either. All we are suggesting is there are phenomenal things that teachers do. Allow them to be taken into consideration. And in LA, this wasn't about first and second year teachers. When we had finished the second round of layoffs when the state was borderline bankrupt, 8- and 9-year teachers were being laid off. That is not a new teacher. That is a person who has had a long track record of giving to students. There was quite a bit of debate about the methodology for evaluating teachers. That actually wasn't part of the trial whatsoever. The whole notion is whatever a district chooses on how to evaluate teachers, it should be but a factor when trying to make the terrible decision about having to deal with layoff. There was chatter about, is it a billionaire who's funding this? I think it's pretty clear that the money spent on the trial is nothing compared to a year's worth of dues that are taken. It happens to be one person. Money is used all the time, except out of students' pockets for their rights. It was talked that it would get rid of due process. You can't abrogate the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of this country. Not whatsoever. You know, King, when he wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, noted that we had waited more than 300 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence, and we still creep at a horse and buggy pace at gaining so much as a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. It may not be for the students of LAUSD or California the cup of coffee, figuratively, but that cup of coffee is a high school diploma. That is what students demand and need. And I believe that no one in LA is confused about our mission. We lift youth out of poverty every day, and we need to use the means necessary, granted by our Constitution, that when folks are aggrieved, they have the same right for redress as you and I do when we feel aggrieved about that. I don't know what the outcome to Vegara will be. It's not for me to speculate. But what I do know is that the conversation raised in this trial talks about issues that have for a long time disproportionately affected some students and not other students. And if we will work in summer school for students who struggle, and we will do TK for students who struggle, and we will create classes so students can learn English proficiently, and we will do X and Y and Z, we would then want to make sure that they had the same right to the same quality of education as any student in LAUSD or any other school system. A lot's been written about the trial, a lot's been talked about the trial.